Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Can you tell whether a country is more innovative than another? You can just feel it, can't you? But how do you measure something like innovation, and why does it matter? And what drives innovation at a country level? Joining me today on Brave New World is Soumitra Datta, the new dean of the business school at Oxford University. Soumitra is one of the few scholars who's been studying innovation at a country level for some time. I'm going to talk to him about this work and also the challenges he faces as the leader of a major business school. Soumitra, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you, Vasant. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
First, congratulations on your new appointment as Dean of the Oxford Business School. Have you gotten into the thick of things already?
Well, thank you. But, Oxford is a unique university, as you know, as some people say, it's a 900-year-old startup. So there's a lot of things to learn out here, some old, some new, but I'm still learning.
Great. So, I'd like to talk to you about a couple of things, including, what you see as some of the challenges in this 900-year-old startup. But before we go there, I'd like to discuss some of your recent research on innovation. But before that, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey and what got you here, to where'd you grow up, where'd you read, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I'll try to keep it short. As you know, we're getting to a point in our lives where journeys can get quite long too. But I think what's interesting is I am an engineer who ended up in a business school. And that is interesting because the last 30 years really have seen a tremendous surge in applications of how technology has changed the world of business. I remember when I joined the world of business schools in the late 80s, people are questioning, is technology even relevant for business? It seems very strange right now, but that was the reality then. And today, technology
Indeed.
is so integrated and so linked so inextricably with business that the two are hard to separate. The other thing that I would say is, I got into by accident the whole area of benchmarking, assessing national policies and technology innovation. There was an association that I had at the World Economic Forum and later with the United Nations. And that has led to some very interesting work at a national level, policy level, which I did not anticipate initially. So most of the work in a business school is at a corporate level, at a firm level. And so this combination of being able to work both at the firm and in national levels has been very insightful for me.
It's funny you mentioned the role of technology in business education because, I recall my colleague Arun Sundarajan and I, as recently, I guess, as 2005, we interviewed, almost 50 business school deans at the time and wrote a paper about how they perceived the role of technology in education. It seemed so bizarre at the time, because we were seeing these platforms emerging. And as recently as that, it wasn't clear to people. And of course, there was this paper by Nick Carr which said, "Does IT matter?" which created a whole storm. Sort of an uphill battle to convince business school leadership that technology really mattered. And, how absurd that question sounds today. So, you mentioned innovation, has been studied, quite extensively at the firm level, but much less so at the country level. Walk us through your method and your data collection and, sort of the messiness involved in getting your arms around that question.
Yes. No, so I think, that's a very important question that we are still trying to get our arms around. I think we have done some part of it, but it's a long journey and probably a very difficult journey to complete in any degree of perfection because it's a moving target at the same time. But I would highlight the first few points to be as follows. When I started down this path, probably in the early 2000s, the definition of what was considered innovation was quite restricted. So it was a very classical, I would say, product innovation perspective, very classical science and technology driven perspective, which was measured by things like patents and publications and PhDs and similar kinds of scientific measures. Now those measures are still very valid, so don't get me wrong, they're still very important, very valid. But what we have seen in the last, I would say, 15 years, innovation become much more broad-based, much more inclusive, and you don't really need a PhD to innovate. There are lots of market-driven innovations which happen from just people pulling together innovations in emerging markets and doing very interesting stuff. The whole rise and examples of frugal innovation in India, a lot of that is very exciting, but at the same time, it's not traditionally measured by the classical metrics. So what I did in 2007 was I started pulling together my thoughts into a more broader, inclusive model of innovation that I termed as a global innovation index. And essentially, it said that, look, you have to take a broader perspective of innovation in which everyone or every organization is capable of innovation. It's not just to the few, it's for the many. And I can tell you that initially the reaction was not a very happy one from the traditional, let's say, players in this area. And it took some time to convince them. But what helped me a lot was WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization. They adopted my model in 2010 and 2011. And since then, I think WIPO's adoption of the model of innovation has really helped. So you have an international organization pushing it and promoting it. So today it's used very, very widely in more than 100 countries around the world. And we, of course, cover about 130 countries each year. And I can tell you it's a very, very messy process of collecting data, of cleaning it up, of trying to pull the metrics together. And many of the components of innovation today are very difficult to measure. And getting data about 130 countries is very, very hard. So, if you just focus also on one country, let's say, for example, the US or OECD countries, a smaller subset, you can get probably a more richer data set. But if you move towards the broader global data set, it's very, very hard, very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine. In fact, as I read the report, the one thing that became apparent to me is just the value of having such a database. I mean, before we even get to sort of what are the major findings, right? Just the existence of such a database is new and unique. And as we get more data, if you can actually collect this data somewhat uniformly about the same kinds of things across countries, then over time we should be able to draw better and more nuanced insights. So I was struck by that, just the value of the database. But what did you actually find? I mean, how would you reduce your findings into a few sound bites? So, and here I'm sort of thinking in terms of, in finance, people think about like factor models that say, okay, you can explain returns in terms of the market and industry and all that kind of stuff. What's the equivalent here? Like, what are the major factors that explain innovation at the national level across the world?
No, it's an excellent question, and I wish we had a complete, accurate answer I could give you on that. But having said this, we have some ideas, we have some initial directions in which we are sort of finding, let's say, useful conclusions. So first of all, the whole definition of what is an innovation. That's still a classical view very much was, you create a product and you take it to the market, and that's basically innovation, and that's still valid. But what we are arguing really is that innovation is much more broad-based, and innovation in the creative services sector is also very important. For example, the kind of outputs you might see in the movie industry or in the publishing industry, or in fact, even in the online, social media sector, they are all examples of innovative outputs. Now, I can tell you that some of these kinds of analysis have proven to be quite influential because countries like Costa Rica, they came and told us that, look, we were completely ignoring the creative services sector when we looked at innovation policies in our country. And now, because of our, let's say, modified realization, we are now including in an analysis and we're doing a much better job of it in our country. Now, if you take, for example, larger countries like India and China and Brazil, there's so many variations in local, regional innovation patterns. And so what we have also found is that many countries are using that basic framework of the innovation model, which essentially consists of a set of input conditions and a set of output conditions. And the input conditions are classical things like the regulatory political environment, the infrastructure of the country in terms of the markets, in terms of the physical infrastructure, the people infrastructure, and other aspects. And all these elements, what we're finding is providing inspiration to countries to create more customized versions of innovation metrics for their own countries. So if you look at, for example, India has created an India Innovation Index, which is a customized version of the global India Innovation Index. And then they use it to benchmark the innovation performance of different states in the country. And then that actually provides a stimulus for different states to compete with each other and try to provide even more conducive environment for attracting investments and so on. So what we're finding is that there is no one magic solution, a magic, sort of bullet that fits every single region, every single country, because the context and the competitive advantages of different regions are different. And so we have to essentially customize often the precise strategies to different nations. But having said this, some elements like investment in human infrastructure, very critical. You don't have good investment in human infrastructure, you'll not actually make much progress. Investments in having a good physical infrastructure. If your roads and ports don't actually work very well, you'll not be able to, again, do much innovation in terms of market success. If your regulatory political environment is not working very well, once again, you'll have challenges in terms of making any successful attempts in innovation. So we often say that innovation success is very much like links in a chain, interconnected links in a chain. You need multiple links and all of them to be equally strong, or at least strong enough. And if you have even one link that is weak, the entire innovation sort of chain becomes weak and doesn't perform as well as it perhaps could. So it's very important to be able to be strong in multiple aspects of different elements of society and of economy to be able to succeed in innovation.
So that's really interesting. So let's, since you're talking about India, let's push on that a little bit more. So are you finding, for example, that the difference in innovation between, let's say, Punjab and Kerala, I just picked two random states, is driven by, let's say, the state of the roads and the quality of educational institutions? So what are you finding to be sort of the factors that explain the differences among different states in India?
So, if you look at, for example, the performances on the different dimensions does explain some of the differences in performance across different states. But having said this, what is very interesting is to look at the specific strategies that different states or different regions are using for supporting their own growth ambitions or growth aspirations. And the growth strategies in India might be very different from the growth strategies in China. And the growth strategies in a state in India can vary quite widely across states. So what we are finding is that you have to be able to get the basic building blocks of having, good in human capital, good physical capital, good market conditions, all there in place. But at the same time, you have to be able to also, have it aligned to fit your own national or regional strategies. So there's an element of some basic common building blocks, yet using the common building block to support specific strategies in different parts of the country or region.
Just sort of pushing a little bit deeper into that. So what's the role of markets versus governments in something like this, right? What kinds of things can you leave to markets, and what kinds of things are ones where government needs to step in? And sort of, where I'm going with this is, that India's sort of had a more paternalistic approach, let's say, to digital infrastructure than the US has, which has sort of left it to markets. And I'm not sure I can point to one being better or worse than the other quite yet. So, but let me come back to that question. What is the role of markets versus governments?
It's a very important question because, we have seen on one hand the role of government best exemplified by countries, I would say not necessarily India, but more like China. Where the Chinese government has been very, very involved in setting up and supporting various aspects of the business environment in general, as opposed to the US, where it's been often said the reverse. But if you look at what's been happening in the last few years, even the US is moving towards a much more government active approach in supporting innovation. The US is also for the first time having some kind of industrial policy in terms of trying to support specific sectors, much like what China has been doing. So I really think you need both. When you ask market versus government, I don't think it's a question of either or, it's a question of and. And different countries or different regions, depending on their own historical context and cultures, might use more of one as opposed to the other. So if you look at, for example, India, you're raising an interesting question. India, I always tell people that India was late to the digital revolution. It was certainly early in the software offshoring, outsourcing sort of development, but in the digital space, it was late as compared to US and China. But India is potentially providing a different way of looking at things. And this is where the market, and the government aspect gets combined. As you know very well, I'm sure many of our listeners also know, India has this amazing, unique biometric database called Aadhaar. 1.3 billion people in the database, which is a free KYC, know your customer identification information that is provided to all providers. Around that, the government has built a whole set of public APIs, so called the India Stack. And any private company can access this government infrastructure of the India Stack and the Aadhaar biometric database to create innovative digital applications. So what you're having in India, even though it was late to the game, is that a much more democratized bottom-up approach to digitalization, as opposed to US and China, which is much more, on one hand, market-driven, on the other hand, more government-driven, perhaps, but much more bottom, sort of top-down, structured approach to digitalization, which is much more, walled gardens built by these big tech companies. So I think, every country has its own approach to how it creates competitiveness, how it creates digitalization, digital economies. And India is a good example where it is showing that there's another way different from the American or Chinese way.
So how did that arise? I mean, what role did culture play in that, in the path that India has taken over? Because I hear that, it was a small group of people, sort of some called it the Bangalore Mafia, or, people who had a vision. And that vision wasn't to sort of enrich themselves endlessly, but to actually sort of do something that was more socially oriented.
So in India, wasn't the lot of the initial motivation came from the poor state of government services and the high level of corruption in the country. So there's a need to provide a better level of government services and to reduce the amount of corruption. There's so much money getting wasted in terms of disbursement, and money would not flow down the government to the actual person who needs it. So the motivation came from there. And yes, it is true that we had a number of, a small group of very smart leaders, including Nandan Nilekani, founder of Infosys, who built out the concepts. And, I spoke to some of them when they were building it out, and they said that there was a deliberate attempt that they made very wisely at not building a complex digital identity as what is common in some other states like Singapore or Finland. So they built a very simplified form of digital identity, which is a simple KYC. And they said it's like, imagine the GPS system in the US. GPS just gives you the location, doesn't tell you what to do with the location. You can deliver a pizza, you can drive somewhere, you can use the information location in your own way. So what the Indian sort of system does, it just gives you identity. It doesn't tell you what to do with that identity verification. And then, of course, the whole system is up to you to how to use it, and APIs, the India Stack, basically makes it easy for you to do so. So I think, there was a genius out there in terms of design, and I think it's worked out very well for India, because India was in a real difficult position of being left out or left behind in the digital revolution. And now I think India, for the first time, has a realistic chance of catching up and being among the leaders. And many other countries around the world, whether it's in Africa or Latin America, who often feel they're stuck between the rock and a hard wall, between the American and Chinese models of being sort of tying themselves to one tech company's walled garden. They see this as a possible alternative route that is much more democratic, much more bottom up. So I think in the case of India, it's always a little bit, organized chaos, as some people sometimes argue about India in general. So I think that's another place where a little bit late, but India has done something very interesting in this space. I think so.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because Nandan often said that the goal was just to answer one simple question, which is, are you who you say you are?
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
And that was the only question that was answered by Aadhaar, and now you can build on top of that. And there's this India stack you referred to, and now you have sort of the payments infrastructure.
Yeah. But the India stack also was built by the government, you see, and the choice to actually make it simple was a deliberate one. So it was actually by looking at, because once you have a more complex core identity architecture like Finland or Singapore, you're again restricting the choices around it. So I think that was a very conscious choice of giving that kind of democratic freedom to the entire system. So I would not be surprised if tomorrow, you have very innovative application. Already the number of unicorns in India is very high, but at the same time, you have the next wave of innovations in this space coming from India as opposed from China.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because you can now have like a guy who's selling coconuts on the side of the road who accepts Google Pay and can actually get a loan from a bank just based on something really simple, which is a capability that actually doesn't exist anywhere else. That's really simple capability.
Yeah, like in India, Google Pay uses the same UPI stack.
Yeah.
So it uses the India stack once again. So it's a pretty open market where everyone is on equal footing. And that, I think, is quite radical.
Yeah, indeed. So I just want to sort of, I guess, come back to other countries in your innovation index. Europe figures quite prominently at the top, and countries like Sweden, Denmark. So what makes a country like Sweden so innovative? Like, what is it about Sweden where there's so much innovation that comes out of there? And I remember watching this show about how a lot of artists, including Britney Spears, Taylor Swift, and Katy Perry, created their hits in Sweden. So what is it about Sweden that enables this kind of innovation?
Well, I haven't lived there personally, so I cannot, let's say, give you firsthand, experiences out there. But what I certainly do know of many of the European countries, not all, is that they have invested very heavily in the social infrastructure, in the government regulatory infrastructure, in the physical infrastructure. As I told you, the image of having multiple links in a chain. And they have a system where the links are all reasonably strong. And the end result is extremely powerful. If you think of, for example, the US, which is extremely strong in hotspots. So you go to, for example, Silicon Valley is outstanding. You can't beat Silicon Valley. Boston, you can't beat Seattle. You have the amazing hotspots. But you have a lot of the US, which is in a pretty sorry state, So there's a huge amount of variance in the country between what is possible in Boston and Seattle and Silicon Valley as compared to what is happening in another random city you can choose in the middle of the country. So I think that kind of, so US sometimes, and often people ask, how come US not ranked number one? Clearly, if you just identify the locus of excellence like Silicon Valley, its par excellence is number one in the world. But as a nation, and if you end up, modeling nations out here, US does have a lot of issues in terms of quality of education. So if you look at, for example, in Europe, the best schools in the world are in the US by and large, with the exception of Oxford and Cambridge, perhaps in the UK. But the best schools are in the US. But guess what? The average education level of the average European is better than the education level of average American. Why? Because the average school is better in Europe. Same thing is true for infrastructure. So the average road infrastructure, the other rail infrastructure is better in Europe as compared to the US. And all this affects small companies that want to innovate, that want to create different businesses and so on. So I think there's a whole positive sort of impact that results from having uniformly good growth and infrastructure and investments in multiple aspects of the economy. And of course, I think what is needless to say is very important is you need some kind of a national vision. If you don't have a national vision and ambition, that's very hard to pull it off just for random chance. In all these Scandinavian countries, if you recall, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they had a massive, rethinking on the economic basis, economic strengths, and many of these countries were based on natural resource economies, and they had to rethink, and they moved to knowledge economy. So there was a conscious investment and change that these economies made because they had the shock of the Soviet sort of collapse of the Soviet Union, some years ago.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make about the sort of variance in the US, and the system as a whole is only as good as the weakest link. And sort of, it gives me a chuckle because it reminds me when I was in Pittsburgh, at one point, Pittsburgh was rated the number one city to live in. And people said, well, why is that? It was all because it's average on everything. There's very little variance. But coming back to the sort of weakest link, what about like trust in public institutions? Do you think that has something to do with it as well? And has there been sort of a decline in trust in institutions in America?
So I think, Edelman does this survey on global trust, and what they see is that there's a general decline in trust worldwide. So there's a number of different reasons why that is happening. Part is social media, part is the high income, inequality that is happening in the salary gaps and executives and non-executives. And there's a whole number of different reasons why that is happening. But I think there's a decline of trust today in multiple aspects of government, of political leadership, of business leadership. And that is a problem, no question about it. I think it's a problem for innovation. It's a problem for, for country societies, and as look at our future. So, we measure some aspects of that in our research, but clearly we could do better if we had more fine-tuned data about this. In fact, one of the most hardest challenges we face in our research is finding good data. Because finding good data on all these multiple aspects across 130 countries is very, very challenging. If you're just looking at data on trust in the US, maybe you'll get some good data, but finding it across Africa, across Latin America is very hard. But to answer your questions about trust, absolutely, I think it's a major issue. And you look at, for example, if in Sri Lanka now we're having, in the midst of a huge crisis in Sri Lanka, if there's no trust in the government of Sri Lanka, who's going to actually invest? No foreigner is going to invest out there. Even the local Sri Lankan entrepreneurs are going to look at other locations to, in fact, start their companies. So investment and innovation levels in Sri Lanka is definitely going to decrease if this trust in government is not there.
So, there's a couple of ways I want to go from here. One is sort of, what should poorer developing countries do? But before I go there, I want to sort of press on China a little bit, because you referred to, the Chinese approach, which is sort of very top-down and surveillance-oriented. And, many years ago, I had this conversation with James Robinson, who at the time had written this book called Why Nations Fail. And then I had him on the pod last year talking about his latest book, which is The Narrow Corridor. And he's a big believer that it's a lot about institutions and sort of achieving that fine balance and power between the people and the state. And that, liberal Western democracies have managed to do that well. They've sort of managed to find what he calls this narrow corridor of a balance of power that has, hindered other countries. And, after his talk, we sort of spent some time together and, spent several hours walking around in Goa before his flight. And I asked him, I said, what about China? Because doesn't that sort of fly in the face of your theory? Because China seems to be, and this was like 4 or 5 years ago, that China seems to be making great strides in terms of, tech innovation and improving the lives of people. A lot of Chinese people are actually very happy with their lives compared to what they were of the previous generations. And so are you optimistic? And his response at the time, which might have changed a little by now, was that no, that kind of a system sort of collapses on itself. I don't see any signs of that occurring. So what are your thoughts about sort of innovation in China? Do you need institutions, or is their system really working like gangbusters?
I don't know if it's working like gangbusters, but I think it is working. And it's working in a different way. So, not everyone has to work in the same way. I gave an example of India, and India is working in a different way. And I think China is working in a different way. We may not like everything we see out there, but guess what? Many of the Chinese actually like what they see out there, and they actually are thriving inside this. You talk about surveillance. London is one of the cities with the highest number of per capita cameras per capita in the world. Now, the only difference, London doesn't do analysis in real time. China does in real time. And China, of course, uses a social score and other kinds of issues. Now, we are horrified by social scores. In the US, we have credit scores that control your financial life to a large degree. Right? You can't do many things in the US if your credit score is bad. Many Chinese, for example, students have told me that, look, the social score in China is giving me some assurance that I can do business with a colleague or with a person I don't know, if I feel that this person is, a reasonable, good, trusted person. So what I'm saying, the notion of how you trust, why you trust, how you build trust is different countries. And I think we shouldn't just disregard them completely just because they look different. Now, having said this, China's innovation rise has been tremendous. Okay, tremendous. In fact, China is now in the top 15 in the world on the innovation index. And it is not just, it's very important to emphasize, it's not just based on copying. It may be true that Chinese companies did copy some things, at some point in time. May be true that some people still copy some things. By and large, China today is the leader in the world in patenting, in publications, in citations. In terms of total R&D spending, it is very close to the US, but growing at a rate which is faster than the US, so probably overtake the US in some time. So there's a lot of real progress in the country, and a lot of it was driven by a conscious decision that the government made 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the government decided that they wanted to be in the top 20 in the world in innovation. And then they decided to invest in university infrastructure, in R&D infrastructure and telecom infrastructure and so on. And of course, the investments in the roads and ports and ships in the physical infrastructure is very legendary in China. But I don't know how many people actually note the fact that China almost grew its number of graduates by a factor of 10 in less than 10 years. I mean, which country has invested so much in higher education such that, you increase the number of graduates by a factor of 10 in less than 10 years? Today, if you look at the most scientific metrics, Chinese universities do extremely well on them. So there's a huge amount of investment that has gone into China, into the whole R&D and innovation ecosystem. And that is probably going to, continue to some degree. Now, the biggest problem of China that I see right now is that the brand of China is not very strong. The brand of China is actually quite weak. And I tell Chinese friends always that the brand of China is, in fact, weaker than the reality in the country in terms of actual progress. And the another problem in China is that China is not making any friends, with many of its policies. And in this world, to be able to, show a leadership position in the world, you do need friends. China is the biggest trading partner of more than 100 countries in the world. In fact, almost close to 130 countries in the world. And that does give it some friends. But having said this, I think China needs to work much more on the softer side of the leadership, and which is important for innovation. That's important. It's not just technology. If you look at the innovation index model, the government regulatory softer side is also very important for innovation success. And it needs to attract capital and attract talent. If today, with all these new sort of negative development in China, global talent does not want to move to China, or talent in China wants to move out of China, that is a problem for China in the future. But as of now, if you ask me, I am still very bullish on China's future. I still think China will continue to do well, and remains to be seen how its current policies will hamper some of future developments. But I think it's done extremely well and probably will continue in the near future also.
You might have actually answered this question already indirectly, but so what can we learn? What can the rest of the world learn from China? What should we be doing in the US and Europe, in India, that we're not doing, where we can learn from China?
It's a good question, and it's a answer which is obviously incomplete answer that I'll give you, because it's very hard to give one answer for the whole country, a big country like China. But I'm sure I can give, and many other people maybe listening can identify many things that happened wrong in China. There are lots of areas of corruption, lots of areas where things can be improved, and lots of things where justice is not done at a social level, and there are lots of issues. I'm not trying to say by any means China is problem-free, so don't get me wrong on that. Lots of issues in China also. But having said this, I think what I like the most about China and the way it has approached innovation is that there's a national vision, national ambition to be number one. And that is very important. So there's a vision and ambition that they have supported in different ways. Even now, for example, in the COVID crisis, the US chose the policy of giving handouts to individuals. Europe chose the policy of giving handouts to companies, and that's how they kept, basically the investments going and sort of the economies going in the COVID time period. China, in contrast, really had a very strong active policy of investing in growth areas, in environmental technologies, in biotechnologies. That's how they did the investment in the growth. So I think they always are looking at the future and investing in the growth areas. And I think China's human capital base is very, very strong. I think China's move, in this whole social media, gaming, and restrictions put on Alibaba and so on have been criticized a lot, and people are very sometimes worried about it. But it remains to be seen. I mean, maybe, in fact, putting restrictions on the number of time, putting limits on how AI algorithms are being used, maybe it's a good thing to actually learn from China and see how we can perhaps do that, because AI algorithms are being used more in society. We don't know exactly what and how they're impacting our lives. Maybe this whole idea of trying to limit the amount of time and the amount of personal data that tech companies collect, on our lives is an interesting, good idea. So I think even some of these more controversial moves that China is doing right now, that is often criticized in the West, we should observe and learn from them, because I'm not saying repeat them necessarily, but learn from them, because in the West we probably need some of the same medicine. But in the West, because of the lobbying power of all the tech industry and many other invested interests, the West probably will never have that kind of aggressive regulations, aggressive rules being rolled out. And the chances of that is very low. So if these social media issues and the whole surveillance economy that people criticize a lot is a reality that we have to be concerned about, maybe we can learn from what China is doing. Not do the same, I emphasize, but try and learn from it.
That's very interesting. I taught an executive MBA class yesterday of a bunch of people visiting from a European university, and it was about the business implications of artificial intelligence, and I'd sort of put together my standard presentation. And at the last minute, a few days before the class, I decided to ask them, let's start with what questions you want asked. And it was interesting. The set of questions they raised really had to do with the ethics and the morality of systems, and whether AI can actually unify people as opposed to dividing them, right? So it was a really, really interesting discussion, and I would not have anticipated those as being sort of the top questions. And out of the 3 hours, we spent close to 2 hours just discussing those kinds of things. So it's interesting you mentioned this, because it's one of those things that I think we've become sensitized to, both by sort of what's happening in China, but also by developments in the US, where people feel that certain systems can and artificial intelligence and technology can tend to perpetuate biases or worsen inequality.
I think Europe is, I've spent quite a few years in Europe, so I know a little bit about the culture and the context out here. I think Europeans and European countries in general are much more concerned about these human side of technology, let's put it this way, how it impacts societies, how it impacts the environment, and so on. So while the concern is all the right concern and the right questions are being asked, the unfortunate reality probably is that there's little that they can do about it, because the whole European technology scene is largely controlled by American companies. So essentially you are in the hands of the big tech American companies who are dictating what is done in Europe. And in a degree, you can believe you can control Google's algorithms or Amazon's algorithms, you're basically fooling yourself. So a lot of Europeans don't fully realize that they have very little control on what is actually happening in the tech world, because they have no choice but to basically follow the American model.
So what about Russia? We haven't talked about that, and Russia is sort of front and center these days. And I asked because 4 years ago I was invited by the central bank to talk at a fintech conference, and I was actually amazed at the innovation happening in Russia and fintech and technology in general. And Russia is a country full of talent. So say more about innovation in Russia, what it was like, and what do you think it'll be like now? After this, for lack of a better word, shit show comes to an end, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Now, I'm very sorry to see, what is happening in the whole Ukraine-Russia situation, because it's of course terrible for Ukraine, and then they're terrible for also Russian, people and Russian institutions. And as you say, I really hope it comes to end as easily as possible. But yes, I admire Russian scientists and Russian mathematicians and Russian programmers a lot. But the reality, in my view, is that Russia as an economic power is not really that important. As a military power, of course, it's super important given the number of nuclear heads and warheads it controls and so on. From an economy point of view, I don't know. I don't find, that's my personal view. I don't find Russia to be necessarily the hotbed of innovation either today or going forward. Uh, will you have interesting things coming out of these countries? Yes, because there are good people out there. But I don't think, Russia is at the frontiers like how, India can be and is to some degree, China is, US is, Israel is, some other countries are. So I'm not that bullish on Russia, and certainly what has happened in the war situation right now will put the country back, quite some time, because talent will leave the country and institutional support will decrease because a lot of resources are getting sucked into this war situation. And that suck on the national drain of resources is going to continue for several years, and it's not going to stop tomorrow. Russia is stuck in the situation for the next 5 years. Even if the war stops, the whole situation will drain resources from the rest of the sectors.
So, last question on innovation, and then I want to turn to sort of the academic side of things and your new role as a leader of a business school. What advice would you give developing countries, based on your research on innovation? Like, how should they be thinking of what model they should follow, in terms of developing their human infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, and the regulatory environment? Do they have lessons to learn from India, the US, the China? Like, how should they think of like what to learn from which of these models?
No, it's an excellent question, because we have almost like, nearly 20 years of data, looked at longitudinal evolution of countries over time. Even though the models have evolved a little bit, it does give you some insights. And what we find is the different strategies are followed by different nations at different economic levels of growth. So typically what you find is low income economies have the best outcomes if they invest in institutions and human capital. So the more they invest in building good institutions in the country and the more they invest in human capital, the better the outcomes innovation are for the low-income economies. For the high-income economies, the best outcomes are those economies that invest the most in digital technologies. The more digitized economies are, the more digitalization is prevalent inside your economy, the better the outcome is. So many of the high-income economies have good institutions already. They've got people in investments already, but the difference is in the digitalization in the high-income economy. So you can find differences between different income group levels and in terms of what works and what doesn't work as well.
Is there a particular country that's relatively poor and underdeveloped that's getting it right, that's sort of doing it better than others?
If you think of, for example, I still would classify India as a poor country. On a per capita basis, India is still a poor country. And I think India is getting it right, certainly. I think India is doing well in many respects. Many countries in Africa also are showing progress. Look at, for example, the classical example that people talk about in Africa is Rwanda. They have a strong political leadership driving it. The Rwanda has actually opened up the space for innovation in key technology areas like drones and so on. So it's doing interesting stuff in that area. But the government made a choice to invest in technologies also, and it's also setting up proper institutional support out there. So I would say, we are seeing signs of progress in many economies in the world. And I'm actually hopeful that the increased awareness of digital technologies, the power, the growth, the exponential rise in the computational capabilities, coupled with the big problems in environment, climate that we are seeing around us, we will see a lot of innovations happen. In India, for example, there's a whole explosion of the whole electric vehicle, electric mobility space. And there's so many interesting examples coming up out there, even though the leading car manufacturer in the country, Maruti, has not even produced even one electric vehicle. So the leading incumbent is not doing anything, but there's so many new companies coming in and innovating in the space. Why? Because India has a massive pollution problem, a massive traffic problem, and we have to try and fix that issue.
Fascinating, Soumitra. Like I've certainly learned a lot and on innovation, and I hope the listeners have as well. So, for the time we have remaining, I just want to come to the role of education and in people's lives these days, and start with your position now at Oxford. What do you see as the major challenges you face in this 900-year-old startup at the business school at Oxford?
I'm still learning, so my answer will be very sort of initial, but I think the challenge really is to be able to get the universities and business schools in particular to respond to this new set of challenges that the world faces. We all realize that the way business has operated in the past for X number of decades is not good enough. It's worked in some ways, hasn't worked very well in many other important ways. And therefore, look at things in a different way. For example, the classical debate around productivity right now that, many people are concerned about lower productivity and so on. The reality is that maybe in the future, the focus of innovation is not productivity improvement in the classical sense. Maybe the focus is on climate, betterment. Maybe the focus should be on inequality reduction and so on. And so you might have other kinds of metrics being brought into the picture. And I'm not sure we in universities or business schools have actually internalized that. Our faculty are not ready for it. If you look at, for example, many companies, they all are wondering what does a net zero strategy mean for me? So how do I actually achieve that? And what are the implications for nations promising net zero by 2050 or whatever time frame they choose? And I don't think our faculty have actually fully adopted it. Now, I can argue and say that, well, university like Oxford are probably at the leading edge because Oxford traditionally has been much more active on this front and trying to look at the world's biggest problems and so on. But there's so much more to be done. So I think this mindset shift is, for me, the biggest challenge of trying to move away from the traditional metrics, the traditional thing that we have done, succeeded probably in many ways, and trying to move in a different mindset, a different perspective of what the bigger things in life are. It's like same thing as you get older in life. Initially when you're in the 20s and 30s, you focus on your job, your money and career and so on. And then as you get older, you look at much more, the bigger purpose of life, the self-realization and so on. And it's a similar story. I think business schools, we have done a lot of stuff on the traditional stuff. And now we have to actually ask the question, what is the bigger purpose of doing all this? And how do we contribute and make a positive contribution towards this? So I think if you ask me as a dean of the school, that's what I think about. I think about the MBA program, the ranking, and these are, I think, important issues. But the bigger issue in my mind is, what can we do out here to make a bigger impact, a positive impact? Because we do have a convening power. The reality is that most top institutions, your institution, NYU, Columbia, Cornell, or Oxford, we have tremendous convening power. And how do we use this convening power to make positive change? And that's not completely, obvious how good we are at doing that.
It's interesting. There's a few things you mentioned, which are that oftentimes the faculty aren't ready for something, right? They're still looking in the rearview mirror. And, I've certainly sort of experienced frustration myself. I was talking about, trying to convince leaders that tech was going to be an important part of business education in the future. And in a sense, now I see tech everywhere. It's, finance is sort of heavily fintech, and marketing is digital, and accounting will be sort of about distributed ledgers and stuff like that. So people have actually seemed to have embraced the fact that tech is infused into pretty much all aspects of business. But I hear you that this new set of challenges or new set of priorities, having to do with climate or inequality or gender balance need to assume greater importance, and I guess need more research as well in order, to sort of come up with sort of some generalizable insights that we can apply going forward.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100% on that.
So, one other thing I wanted to touch on, and this has to do with sort of the revenue pressures that institutions face, including business schools, right? We're always sort of looking over our shoulder and saying, how do we innovate? How do we grow? How do we get more resources? Well, last week there was this article in the Wall Street Journal that talked about business schools sort of partnering with digital platforms, and some of that stuff hasn't worked out very well. There was a case, I guess, of 2U, which is a digital platform, partnering with UNC and Berkeley, where people who applied for it actually felt that they were misled. So how do you think about, how business schools should go about sort of partnering with these new players, these digital platforms, in a way that will be productive? And by the way, just to give you some background here, it's about 7 or 8 years ago, we had this conference at NYU about, the future of digital education. And I felt that universities were a threat from digital platforms. It turns out I was wrong, because universities are much more powerful brands than digital platforms. So it hasn't quite worked out that way. But how do you think about the role of digital platforms that offer more of sort of a utility-based education, and how maybe universities can partner with them?
So, I think it's something that I think about myself too. I think the future model of education is still yet to be discovered. Education for a long time was pretty resistant to change, especially technology change. And we are at this classical innovator's dilemma moment of Clayton Christensen, at which we are seeing signs of life in the new model, yet we are stuck between the current model and investments in the new model. And my own feeling is that it's less about knowing what the right model right now is, and more about having the fastest rate of learning. What's the speed of evolution of learning and change that you can actually have? And that's where actually I'm most concerned. So if you think about what many of the digital platforms represent, many of them represent the entry of venture capital into education. And with the entry of venture capital into education, what happens? The venture capital model is basically what? You overinvest in companies, force them to innovate, change, find what works, and then keep on investing in the model that works. Out of the 10 different options, maybe 8 will fail, and maybe 2 will work, and that's the model. So you keep on investing, and basically venture capital wants you to fail fast for that reason. So I think what the good side is that these tech companies are going to speed up the rate of innovation in education, and that you see is already happening. The challenge for us is to be able to move equally fast or keep up with the pace, because if we don't keep up with the pace, I think we will eventually be at a disadvantage. At least many of the companies where universities will be at disadvantage. The larger ones today, certainly we have the benefit of brand and scale, and we are able to survive this right now. But none of us are protected from this. It's like, for example, GM is not protected from Tesla, neither is BMW. So I think, all these big brands eventually will come under some threat or pressure if you don't keep the rate of change of learning and innovation fast enough and high enough. So for me, it's much less the digital platform concept, but much more the fact of experimenting, innovating, and trying to find the next model or the best model that works for our customers in different ways.
Yeah, that's well said. In fact, Clay Christensen was one of the people at that at that event, and he spoke about disruption, but he was sort of agnostic, and I think wisely so, about whether these platforms would be disruptive, and whether disruption would take place in education, and the trajectory of that. John Sexton, who was at that time the president of NYU, sort of, his view was that, that universities are a symphony, that you need all parts of the orchestra to produce the symphony, which isn't easy to copy. And that's what makes universities special. And I remember reading something by James March, the famous organization theorist, who said, well, universities are sort of like temples. They're not like, traditional institutions. And, so when I thought of all this, I said, maybe I just overestimated the impact of digital platforms on education. But the other side to me says, maybe I was just early, maybe there is disruption on the horizon, and we just haven't seen the form it's going to take.
Yeah, I think I agree with the latter statement. There is disruption for sure. We're not sure what form it'll take. But for me, the biggest potential for all this platform-based models education really is access. I think the whole question of how do we access hundreds and thousands of students and even millions of students as opposed to a few thousand is an important one. And if you want to achieve the UN SDG goals in education, there's no way that a current business model will achieve it. And we are hopelessly inadequate, as you know. So even if you want to achieve and serve the minimum education needs of millions of young people around the world, we have to move to different models of education, which are more platform-based, have a different product price mix. So I think there's a whole area of innovation that is very, very important that has to happen. I personally don't think there's any revenue pressures. Honestly think there's so much of potential revenue that in education is a growing business. But the fact of the matter is we have a mindset challenge, a mindset constraint. So if the mindset is, you can't lower prices, or there's only one way we can do things, or there's something, that doesn't work, then we will just constraining our rate of innovation and constraining the potential of what we do. So I always tell colleagues that in a business school, special education, there is no shortage of opportunities, no constraint on revenue side.
We've talked a lot about human capital, and we're in the space of education, which is all about developing human capital. And one of my guests, actually one of the earliest guests on the platform, Scott Galloway, who's actually quite critical of American universities, especially brand names, for sort of their elitist mindset, right? He says that it's they take pride in turning away 99% of the applicants, and there's something wrong with that mindset, where education should be much more accessible to people. And you and I have grown up in India, where education was relatively accessible at a low cost. So how do you think about that? How should brand name schools be thinking about sort of more of the social service, their social role in educating the young people in their country?
Yeah. So I completely agree with Scott on most of the points he makes on this point. And I think, we need to have a portfolio of products, because typically now what we have is we have one product and we try and sell it at one price to everyone. And we don't really differentiate across different customer segments. And I think we need to be able to accept the fact that the different products, the different price points, the different customer segments. It's a basic thing of marketing. But somehow we haven't got that part of the university business model, especially the elitist business universities or business schools. We somehow think that maintaining a high price and exclusive access is the success criteria that we should strive for. And I disagree with that completely also. So, it's an interesting challenge for all of us collectively, but how we overcome that, because, the reality, as you know very well, in a university context, is that the dean or the president cannot make these changes. The faculty have to do it. The faculty have to vote for it. If tomorrow you want to launch an online MBA at a fraction of the regular price, I cannot do that as a dean. I cannot mandate that. I have to convince faculty, and the faculty have to vote for it. They have to be behind it. There's a pretty complex change process to be managed out there. And doing that is not easy. And that's the reason why many of these things don't really happen that easily.
You're very interesting. I'm struck by this point you made about the portfolio of products, and certainly at Stern we've sort of got on the MBA, but there's all kinds of sort of specialized master's programs that make up the portfolio, but they don't address the other kind of segmentation, which is that we're still accepting just sort of the elite in each of these programs,
and at a
but
price
not
point.
people. Exactly.
And at a high price point. Exactly.
At a high price point. Yeah. So that actually remains a challenge, to accept people who are not the elite and at a much lower price point. Interesting. Well, Soumitra, any closing thoughts? It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I've learned a lot, and I hope the listeners have as well. Any parting thoughts?
No, thank you. I think I enjoy your shows and your recordings. So keep it up. It's great work. I think what you're doing in terms of getting different speakers together, and we all have to learn from each other, and we keep trying to inspire each other. So that's what I'm also trying to contribute a little bit towards. Thank you so much.
Indeed, and I wish you much success in your new role at Oxford. And thanks again for being on the pod. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you so much, and I hope I can welcome you out here at my home college in Balliol sometime.
I will take you up on that for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasan.